people alike who don't get into racism, that most of their children are in jail. And the other ones who see color, the other ones who deal exclusively with their ethnicity, their children are outside and their children are being fed and so forth. Is the reward then for not seeing color, for being non-racist, for not talking hate language, going to jail? Well, you better start talking hate language then. You know? Answer me this. Why is it? Okay, we'll have to. Why is it? You see, we talked about this business in this kind of situation. If God is no respecter of people, if God loves us all the same, not one group any better than the other, you get whole peoples being wiped out from the face of the earth. Did God love the Indians less? But no, you say he loves everybody the same. That's a dangerous kind of love, baby. Then it must say then God loving us all the same is not necessarily our basic protection. Because despite our being loved all the same and not one being held above the other, we see all kinds of inequalities in the world. And we've seen certain groups destroyed and wiped away from the face of the earth. And you know what I find amazing about that too? Is that the people who've done the greatest part of the wiping away are the people who worship the same God we do. Yeah. They pray to Jesus like we do, don't they? And yet somehow we got enslaved, and yet somehow we are brutalized and killed out here. We got to deal with some real issues here somewhere. There's something not quite right here. You know what else I find interesting? That those who were supposed to be the chosen people of God really got the ovens. So apparently it takes a little more than just praying. It takes a little more than just feeling like you got a special relationship to survive on this earth. Being the favorite of God apparently is not quite enough to protect you. And I can see why to a degree, because God has already blessed you with the mind. He's already blessed you with the brain. But we got some people who think it's holy not to use it.
Teacher. Right.
Yeah.
Amen. Teacher.
Yeah. They think the pursuit of knowledge is a sin. The pursuit of learning is a sin. Even though this is a knowledge machine. This is a learning machine. This is a thinking machine. This is an analyzing machine. A remembering machine. And God must have put it in our heads for some reason. And for us not to use it is blasphemy. And maybe that's why those who don't use it end up ultimately going the way of perishing from the face of the earth. But we have this peculiar thing then of receiving the gift from God, as we say, and then refusing to use those gifts. And yet we expect it to be protected by God when we reject the gifts he gives us. And you know I've talked about the gifts that black children have. Gifts second to none. We're given the best gifts in the world. We were the first people God ever even created.
Teacher. All right.
Yes, sir. We have minds that are second to none. Yet somehow we've been deceived into thinking that to use them is to be non-black. That means our consciousness has been created by someone else. Consciousness then is a power. It's a type of power. How much power consciousness has depends upon its level and its organizational state and its functional state. That's why other people who want to use other people seek to control their what? Their consciousness. Because one thing about consciousness, the state of consciousness you're in determines what you're capable of doing or not doing. If you're in one level of consciousness, you can do one thing. If you're in another level of consciousness, you can do another. One of the greatest problems we have to solve in trying to achieve our fullest development is knowing how to control our consciousness in such a way that we can bring to a task or a problem or something and the level of consciousness appropriate to it. You see, how to match level of consciousness, organization of consciousness with problem, with circumstance, you see, and how to be able to do that through our will. That's a very difficult task to achieve. In other words, then, when we know our body needs rest, it cannot get rest if we remain in a state of wakeful consciousness, can it? Not in the deepest sense. It cannot receive the restoration and rebuild itself as long as it's highly what? Aroused. So what do? We put ourselves, or let ourselves do what? Go into the consciousness of what? Sleep. You see? And once we go into that consciousness, the body begins its healing process and reparative process, you see, and recreating process. And we awaken, energize, and heal, and with the clarity of consciousness that permits us to function. And you can't get that kind of healing and clarity of consciousness and restfulness and reparation unless you go into the consciousness of what? Sleep. But while you're asleep, you can't do what? Certain other things. So there are things you can do when you're awake and alert and in that state of consciousness that you can't do when you're asleep. And there are things you can do when you're asleep that you can't do when you're in another state of consciousness. And there are many levels of consciousness, you see. And if we could recognize them and know what behaviors are related to them, we will be able to regulate our behavior in a very appropriate way by regulating the levels of consciousness related and correlated with those behaviors. And therefore, you see, consciousness enables us to achieve certain ends. It makes it possible for us to accomplish certain things. And when you are able to achieve certain ends and accomplish certain things, that means you're exercising power. Because power involves the ability to achieve certain ends against resistance. The ability to act in terms of one's own interests. Depending on the state of consciousness you're in, you will relate not only to yourself in a very sort of way, but you will relate to others in different sorts of ways. If you're in a state of consciousness that you call anger, your relationship to that same person when you were in love changes, doesn't it? Your language changes, your body changes, everything changes when that state of consciousness is in possession. When you're feeling lovely and all of this, the language changes, the body changes, and other things happen. You see. Therefore, people who want to control other people seek to control their consciousness. Consciousness is to a good degree a social product, meaning that it is created as a result of the nature of the type of social interactions we have with other people to a good extent. And when you look then at the consciousness of black people in America and of African people in the world, the consciousness that we exhibit to a good degree at this point reflects the nature of the interaction we have with European people. And one of the major objectives of European people is to manipulate and control the consciousness of African people. And through their manipulation and control of the consciousness of African people, divert that power which ordinarily